perspectives, and that's around, a granular level, at the institutional level, and the organizational development level, excuse me, and just an overall arching view to be presented at the end. We'd especially like to thank our sponsors listed on this slide here for their support, which has allowed us to keep form registration free for everyone for this year. Thank you. And some of the usual housekeeping reminders for today's call. Please keep yourself on mute during the presentation. Introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like with your name, organization, and preferred pronouns, but I already said that earlier. Please use the chat for questions at any time, and we're going to be recording the session to post online. Following the presentation, there'll be breakout sessions to give us all an opportunity to network a bit and consider some of what we've learned. We hope you'll join us for those conversations, that being said. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our amazing panelists. So starting with Nicole Mclean, she was born and raised in Lynn, Massachusetts, and has a bachelor's degree in early education. She joined the Army National Guard in her junior year of high school. Nicole is a veteran, having been deployed to Iraq in 2004 and 2008, and is also an entrepreneur. She is owned and operating Rising Stars Childcare Service, a home-based early education service for 6 years of age children, and is the current founder and president of North Shore Juneteenth Association, whose mission is to expose all cultures to positive images and aspects of Black American culture. This organization has collaborated with a sizable amount of organizations on the North Shore of Essex County, especially during COVID, around food security. Nicole is a mother, wife, and is currently working at Bright Horizons as a health and safety director. Ann Hayes, and Nicole's preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. And Ann Hayes, preferred pronouns she, her, hers. Ann joined the Food Project in 2019 as executive director, and prior to joining, Ann was the chief operating officer at Trinity, Boston Connects. Over the course of her time, Ann supervised all aspects of organization, from youth development programs to organizational equity consulting, from finance and operations, development, and communications. Ann's engagement with the Food Project goes back to 2009, when she led the first of 2 pro bono consulting projects focused on marketing to youth and financial sustainability. She is also the parent of an alumna of our TFP's youth programs, who have worked with TFP since from 2011 to 2015, and received her bachelor's from Dartmouth College and her MBA from Harvard Business School. In her spare time, Ann loves to garden, cook, read, and travel. Excuse me. Introducing M. Scott Knox, preferred pronouns he, him, his. M. Scott Knox is the executive director of Root, and prior to joining the Root team, Scott worked at Brook Charter Schools, a network of high-performing college preparatory public charter schools in Boston for 8 years in a number of senior leadership capacities, including chief operating officer and chief development officer. Before Brook, Scott worked at the Stepping Stone Foundation as Dean of Academic Preparation and as Vice President of National Expansion. Scott has also worked with Jumpstart, has taught 8th and 10th grade English, and has directed an AmeriCorps service program in New Orleans. Outside of work, Scott is on the board of Silver Lining Mentoring, the only mentoring program in Massachusetts, which focuses on, long-term mentoring and life skills coaching to youth in foster care. Scott is a beekeeper, though his most recent queen of the hive, Bina Simone, unfortunately didn't make it this past season, is a gardener and lives in Roxbury. Scott holds a BA from Boston College and an MPA from Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And Tracy Tracy Talbert, Miss Talbert, preferred pronouns she, her, hers. Tracy is a person who appreciates and values the significance of cultural competence. And does she bring that. And she uses cultural competence as a tool for achieving success and making significant changes in our ever-changing world. She is a tennis player and tennis coach for children. She loves to cook, listens to jazz, and goes for a jog now and then. Born and raised in Springfield, Massachusetts, Tracy spends most of her time in career sales, starting off in retail, then car sales, and the last 22 years in banking. 10 of those years 10 of those banking years as a branch manager, a 2017 graduate of Springfield College, School of Professional and Continuing Studies, earning a master's degree in organizational management and leadership. She spent the last 6 years facilitating presentations on diversity and cultural awareness in various organizations, incorporating customer service skills as a strategic initiative to develop a team and to grow a business. Tracy has been co-teaching diversity classes at Cambridge College as a learning opportunity, enhancing her core passion, which is sharing experience and knowledge. Her role as the racial justice community engagement leader for the Franklin County to further the work of equity, inclusion, working with business owners to identify process and systems that are barriers to people of color. Ms. Talbert has utilized her degree, appreciation for cultural awareness, customer service excellence, and leadership skills to establish the African American Female Professor Award Association. The goal of the organization is to honor and recognize an unrepresentative group of women in higher education, which is the African American female. An African American female represents 1%, it's an interesting fact, of higher education. The first award presentation occurred in September 2017, and it was a success. So it brings quite the overarching viewpoints to this equity conversation. And with that being said, that is all of our amazing panelists, and we move on to the panel session. And I believe I'd like to pass that on to you, Anne.
Hi, I didn't realize I was first, but great.
Sorry, that was Nicole. I'm sorry, Anne. Yeah, that was Nicole.
Okay, do you want Nicole to go first?
Yeah? Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, Norris, for inviting us, and thank you for having such an amazing panel discussion. I really appreciate being here. As was said, I'm Nicole Mclean, and I started the North Shore Juneteenth Association as a way of educating the community north of Boston about Black American culture and contributions to our country. It was an idea of mine because of, just having to always go to Boston. Originally, having to always go to Boston to celebrate the Juneteenth holiday at Franklin Field. But then when my son was 16 years old, he experienced some police brutality in our city. And that really did amp up the reason for me to start this organization, because I feel Black Americans are treated unfairly and differently a lot of the time because people just are not educated on who we are, where we come from, what we've contributed. They just, are, bombarded by stereotypes of the American culture, and they just assume things from those stereotypes. So that really did force me to, bring the North Shore Juneteenth Association to the forefront and make it more of a North Shore based organization rather than focusing on the city of Lynn. So that's a little bit about me and my organization. We've done flag raisins last year in a lot of different communities on the North Shore, and we, intend to expand that a little bit more this year and just continue to educate our community and, be a force for good in our community. Thank you.
Thanks for that. All right, Anne. I can take it away.
Great. Thanks, Norris. As Norris said, I'm Ann Hayes. I'm the executive director of the Food Project, and I've been here about 3 years now, but have a long history with the Food Project through my daughter's involvement here. As many of you may know, our mission is to create a thoughtful and productive community of youth and adults from diverse backgrounds, working together to build a more just and sustainable food system. And in preparing for this panel and thinking about what Norris asked me to think about, being an ally and empowering BIPOC people and partners, I started out thinking about it the way that we have as an organization to a certain extent more recently by looking internally to ensure that we're living it out in our own organization, in our own backyard before we're, looking more significantly at how we are doing it out in the world. And when I think about how we're doing this work, and how we measure how we're doing this work in some ways, I think about sort of 3 areas of focus from my perspective. One is ensuring that our staff, leadership, and the board are representative. And that can include kind of by the numbers, what does that look like? What does it look like for us to recruit, hire, and onboard intentionally? How are we promoting intentionally? Those kinds of things that I'll talk about. The second thing is ensuring that this, what we call Jedi, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, that ensuring that that Jedi work is central to the organization. And we're doing that both through all staff work, but also with committees at the youth, staff, and board levels that I'll talk about. And then finally, at the leadership level, thinking about me as a white leader and knowing when I should be stepping up and ensuring that I'm giving the work the attention that it deserves, and when I should be stepping back and making the space for others to take the lead. So in talking about where we are from a diversity or representation standpoint, I think I usually think about us on 3 levels. Our youth, who are employees, we do hire and pay all of our young people. And for the last 30 years, we've been really intentional about bringing youth together from very diverse backgrounds to do that meaningful work of growing healthy food for the communities where we work. And we're really explicit in our efforts to recruit and hire across race, across socioeconomic status, geography, gender identity, a whole raft of aspects, and then super clear about putting youth together in crews that represent that diversity as they're working. So I feel like on the youth side, we've been doing it really well for a long time. On the staff side, I want to note that the ultimate goal for the food project might be different than it is for other organizations. As I mentioned, we're hiring youth across race and gender identity, and we work in both urban and suburban communities. So being reflective of that involves having both white and BIPOC staff, folks on staff, in leadership, and on the board as well. So we're thinking about it as bringing a lot of different people together. So by the numbers, I would say that our staff and leadership are more diverse at more levels than they've been in a long time. So over the past 3 years since I've been here, the percentage of folks on staff that are BIPOC hasn't increased that much, maybe 40 to 45%. But we have gone from having only 2 BIPOC folks at a manager or director level in those roles 3 years ago to having 7 people in those roles now. And at our leadership team level, 3 out of 5 of our leadership team members are now BIPOC folks, and where we only had 1 out of 5 3 years ago. But that's only part of the story, right? The numbers are part of the story. The other part of the story is, how do we ensure that we're hiring and promoting BIPOC folks into higher level roles? I think one promising bit of news that we have is that we now, for the first time, have a youth alum who's a person of color in a director level role. We have never had a youth alum in a director level role. And so that's kind of, they bring just a totally different perspective and experience to that role, which is wonderful. But as we're thinking about recruiting, interviewing, onboarding, what are we doing about that? And I think on the recruiting side, we're thinking a lot about where we need to post our positions to get a more diverse candidate pool to start with, because often that is a place where we struggle. On the interviewing side, we're trying to incorporate questions around Jedi work very early in the process so that we don't get too far along and get too committed to a candidate before we understand and consider where folks are on their journey and if or how we can support them in this work. And then once we get to the onboarding piece, we're thinking through what new and current employees need to understand about the work and how we can provide that training. And then ultimately, because often the folks who come to us, BIPOC folks who come into the organization, enter at our youth development specialist role or whatever, how are we providing pathways from that into higher level roles so that folks can stay at the organization while still moving forward with their careers? And we're have done some restructuring to allow for that and are thinking about doing more around that. So we have more opportunities for people to get promoted from within. On the board side, when we think about diversity by the numbers, when I first started, we had 6 BIPOC trustees out of a total of 22, or just over a quarter, and no youth board members. And today we have 10 BIPOC trustees out of a total of 20, so half our board, and we have 3 youth board members, which once again, we always think about providing those different perspectives. So when we're focusing on recruiting new board members, we think about who can bring different perspectives about the work, different lived experience, different skill sets that we need. And one thing that came up recently in our board Jedi task force was a question about, are we thinking about recruiting to get diversity across different skill sets? And the example that was given was our finance committee. So we may have a pretty diverse board, but our finance committee is not diverse. And so we might need to think about how we're recruiting for those kinds of roles. And so that's something that's come up in one of those things. And it makes us more, having those committees makes us a lot more aware and gives us a place to talk about those things. So that brings me to the second thing, which is the Jedi work and ensuring that it's a priority. So on the youth level, I would say the work that we do with all of our young people is designed to support their growth in that area on a personal level, by developing deep relationships with other young people from very different backgrounds, and then on a more professional level through workshops about the food system and various forms of oppression. So those workshops provide that thought-provoking content for young people, and the nature of farm work really provides them with the time and space to learn and to have those meaningful conversations about things that really matter, particularly around this work. And last spring, we piloted a Youth Jedi committee with a small number of young people. And we fully launched it this fall with 9 members and a staff member to help with logistics and facilitation. But there is a lot of youth engagement and leadership in this, and they're kind of taking control of it and running with it and spending time thinking about a lot of different aspects of how that work shows up in the organization and in the outside world. Our staff Jedi committee, we restarted after a long pause, I think of several years, in October of 2019. We range from having about 6 to 8 staff members on that over the past couple of years. And we currently have 3 leadership team members out of a total of 5 of us on the leadership team, including me. And one of the things is we've been thinking about recently is balance on that, and thinking about where should, is this an area where I should be stepping up or stepping back? Is this an area where we have maybe too much leadership on the team and not providing enough space for other people? So we're thinking a little bit about that, but we definitely want to give this the focus and attention it deserves. That committee has done a variety of things over the past couple of years, and I think Norris is probably going to ask me more about that, so I might skip over that a little bit, but I will say that one of the key things that we've been doing is an audit of staff, and now staff and youth around Jedi, around the Jedi work, around our values, around the organizational culture, and I can share a little bit more about that later. We also have started affinity groups, and we're doing some all-staff trainings that I can get into later too. And then we started also a board Jedi task force in September of 2020. So that's been just over a year. And nearly half our board is on that task force, and 4 out of 5 of our new board members self-selected to join it. So it's got a lot of enthusiasm and attention. And the goals of that task force are to support and align with the work with the Jedi work across the whole organization, and then to think about establishing core competencies for board members across both Jedi content, so skill building and training, and process around norms, culture, expectations, and so on. And so I think those things are all moving forward and working together, and I can answer more questions about those later. But the final thing that I kind of wanted to address is what we can call the elephant in the room, which is me, which is a white leader trying to lead this organization. And I have to admit, when Norris first asked me to be on the panel, I was nervous about saying yes. I feel like I made plenty of mistakes in this role and in this work. And then I also understand that sometimes it helps people to hear about those, and maybe we can all learn from them. So just wanted to share a couple of examples of things that I feel like I've struggled with a little bit. The first being that, the organization has worked within the Dudley community for over 25 years and in Lynn for over 15 years. That we have a lot of partnerships with BIPOC residents and BIPOC-led organizations. And I personally am still pretty new to this work and still learning how to do it well and thinking about how to grow those partnerships. And one example I'll give is one of my directors. I'm sort of gung-ho moving ahead on one of our strategic plan objectives and very excited about it. And one of my directors, who is a person of color living in the community, encouraged me to step back from that a little bit and take a pause and think about how are we going to engage the community to ensure that what we want to do is what the community needs and wants us to do. And so starting further back in information gathering, not starting as far along as this is what we want to do, what do you think? But what do you want to see? And having less of that sense of urgency and spending more time in stake building and recognizing that rushing decisions is probably going to take us more time in the long run because we're going to be backfilling that buy-in and maybe not coming to the best decision in the end. So I give that as an example. And I also recognize that I shouldn't have to rely on one of my directors who happens to be a community member and a person of color to highlight that for me. And I need to take this learning to heart going forward. And the second example I would give is around restorative circles. And I don't know how many of you use those tools in your organization. It's something that we did when I worked at Trinity Boston Connects, something we haven't done as much here, but we recently had a challenging situation around talking about how to compensate for this work, this Jedi work within the organization. And by that, I mean financially compensate. And it was a really challenging conversation. And it ended and there was a lot of, maybe hurt feelings and things like that. And we waited a while. And then ultimately, one of the directors I work with and I decided we would sit down with the other two people and do a circle. And it allowed us to think about, like, how do you feel about what happened? And how do you personally, what was it like for you? And understanding that and hearing that for all of us, I think, was a big learning experience. And for me, probably the biggest takeaway was we should be doing that earlier and more often when we have situations like this that come up. So I can talk about that a little bit more going forward if there are questions about that. But those are kind of two examples where I find myself, I've made mistakes and I need to figure out this balance of stepping up and stepping back and making sure that I'm maintaining these learnings going forward and being the ally that I should be in this work. So I just really appreciate you all listening and happy to answer any questions as we go along.
Thank you, Anne, for providing that view from the institutional level. I really appreciate it. And we will come back and ask some questions, some follow-up questions. But moving on, Scott, would you like to take us through being an ally at the organizational planning and initiatives level, please?
Sure, absolutely. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Norris, for the invitation to be here. And it's great to be here with Nicole and Tracy and Anne. So as Norris shared, I've been asked to speak about how Root works as an ally and how we work to empower BIPOC partnerships through our planning and our initiatives. And I'll share a little bit more about Root in a moment, but just, two things to kind of contextualize. Root's a really young organization. We're less than 5 years old, and we're very much a work in progress. So you'll kind of hear that thread through some of my comments and sharing this morning. And the second thing is something I bring from, as Norris shared in my introduction, my background, a big part of my background has been inside schools as a teacher and as an administrator. And I think about so much of this work about being intentional and being an ally and how we show up as part of BIPOC partnerships, that there's no one thing. And so people would often ask about schools and about great teaching, like, what are the 5 things I should be doing to be a great teacher? Or what's the silver bullet or the magic sauce at the school? And there is no one thing, there is no playbook. This is about executing kind of hundreds of actions and habits intentionally over and over and making them just that, habits. So just those 2 contextual pieces. So a little bit about Root. As I shared, we're a young organization. We're based here in Salem. We are a youth empowerment organization that focuses on job training and in transitional employment model for young adults 16 to 26. Most of the young people we partner with live here in the North Shore, representing Salem, Lynn, and surrounding communities on the North Shore, but we've had individuals as far south as Brockton, all the way up to Lawrence participate in our program. So we operate a 14-week culinary training program. And so over those 250 hours, young people are learning the skills to become a prep cook or a line cook, as well as the general workforce readiness skills that any young adult needs to be successful in a job, regardless of the industry. Our model is a little unique in that we operate 3 social enterprises. So we have a cafe here in Salem, we have retail catering across the North Shore, and then we have an event space here on Salem Harbor. And all 3 of those are engines for youth employment. So I mentioned the training piece, that's the 14-week training program, and then the transitional employment. Something that's a little bit new to our enterprise model came as a result of the early days of COVID. So early on in COVID, we launched a food insecurity initiative called Community Catering. And as our cafe and our catering slowed down and went into hibernation mode because of the pandemic, we pivoted our kitchen assets, our young people, human capital, and talent to start making meals for those in need. And I'll talk a little bit about that through the lens of our partnerships in a moment. In terms of our community, so the youth community in Root, over 50% of our young adults, 16 to 26, identify as a person of color. Our staff, 45% of staff identify as BIPOC. And our board, only less than 20% of our board identifies as BIPOC. So, again, going back to that, we are very much, a work in progress in how Root effectively integrates and represents and shows up within the community that we're working with. So just, another bit of context about our model and who we work with through the lens of partnership. So like probably a lot of folks on this Zoom call, nothing we do is in a silo. Like, we are only able to work through partnerships, and whether that's how we identify prospective young adults to participate in our training program. We have a broad network of referral agencies, so state agencies like DCF, DTA, Mass Rehab, schools, public charter, small learning environments, nonprofits, community-based organizations. They're all helping to identify and refer the young people we work with. So that's kind of one bucket. Second are our employer partners. So we work with over 40 restaurants and food service partners across the North Shore. And these small businesses, mostly locally owned, are employing our young adults. They are offering and hosting offsite externships. So that's where a young adult does anywhere from 4 to 8 shifts at one of their restaurants. And then the third bucket is our food insecurity work. So I mentioned this is a little bit newer to Root within the last 20 months. And so we're trying to dial up, if you will, like our superpower, which is to do scratch cooking, healthy, nutrient-rich meals, but then work with those agencies that are much more community-facing, client-facing, that are actually doing the work with individuals and families who are facing food insecurity. So we work with a variety of pantries, shelters, soup kitchens, residential settings, such as My Brother's Table in Lynn, LifeBridge here in Salem, Beverly Bootstraps, Open Door up in Gloucester. And then we also work with a variety of local farms and growers, including Ann and her team at the Food Project, New Entry Sustainable Farming Project, and Three Sisters up in Ipswich. So we're trying to walk the walk by spending our money for wholesale produce from some of our community partners. So that goes back to, it serves the need of our meals being nutrient rich, being healthy, and we're investing in local growers and partners. So that's, again, a little bit more of the table setting. As far as our approach, I'll just share a few things. I think that there's some guiding principles about how the Root staff team and myself, what we bring to our work, and I'll use it through the lens of our community catering. I think so much is about doing our homework, right? And again, I don't think there's anything I'm going to say that's novel or nothing that folks aren't doing on their own or much better than we're doing. And again, this represents, we're a young organization, but I'll just share a little bit of our experience. So doing your homework, we want to make sure we know who our partners are and who our prospective partners are. If we're walking into a meeting or even after an introduction, trying to get a really sense of what's important to our stakeholders. And part of that means bringing exceptional humility to kind of conversations and to learning. I had a boss years ago who would share, don't present yourself as a solution, like put your head down and do the work. And I think that that's very much of what we're trying to bring within that humility. I think, we all struggle. There's only 24 hours a day, but as part of doing your homework also means showing up. And that's showing up for partners, whether something of significance happens, whether it's celebratory or something sad or difficult for a community. And we want our partners to know that they are known to us and that, what's important to them by nature is important to us as a key partner. I think second, one of the things that we're trying to embrace as a team is that growth mindset. So just understanding that on our continuum of being allies in terms of cultural competency, in terms of our work within DEI, that we are all a work in progress and we should all have a growth mindset towards this. So something that we're trying to invest in across the board, across the staff, and with our younger adults is integrated professional development and discussion. And just recognizing that this is about growth for each person and that collectively we are, taking our first steps, but the individuals in our community are all at different stages and wanting to kind of recognize where folks are at. The third, this kind of goes without saying, but important to share, just being honest where you're at. So I think how we show up with our partners, how we represent ourselves is how I'm trying to do a little bit today, and just sharing, with that humility that we're trying to embrace a growth mindset. And this is something that we're working to get better at. Fourth, and just, two more pieces. One is, as we look at internally at Root, some of the strategic planning and bigger picture, more macro conversations is we want to make sure that we're not making these decisions, having these conversations just internally. As I shared, our model is so dependent upon partnerships. So 2 years ago, when we invested in a strategic planning process, we had 55 external conversations. And all of those interviews and discussions helped inform, our 5-year plan. And it took a ton of time, and that was a big burden, but a worthwhile investment on both our board and our staff to make time for those conversations. Part of that for us is about putting youth first and making sure that youth voice is always integrated in our strategic planning. So, in those 55 interviews, separate from that was a series of focus groups, with graduates of Root's training program, with the youth currently in the program. Right now, a piece of strategic work for us is looking internally at our 6,000 square feet of space here in Salem. And, as an organization, we're growing, our model is evolving. I mentioned this new community catering piece. And so it's putting tension points on the size of our kitchen, In other words, our kitchen's not big enough to keep up with the training and production demands. We have a growing team. And as we've been looking at our facility space and ways that we can improve it, we're spending a lot of time listening to young adults of how would they want the space to be set up? How do they think we can improve the layout? And also starting to talk to our partners about that who use our space. So the last piece I'll share is just around advocacy and how we use and lend our voice for our allies. And Anne said something that really resonated earlier in her comments. And it's, this walking the walk. And if there's anything that we are going to promote externally as important to us, or as a key value, we're trying to be really intentional of how does that show up here at Root? And are we living with integrity and doing all the things we need to be doing around, certain values or certain habits or certain ways of being before we start to kind of promote it externally? And so just to be a little bit more concrete about it, one of the things we talk about is those employers, those restaurants, those food services who are really positive work environments for graduates of our training program. Those work environments where mentorship is emphasized, where there's opportunities for growth, where there's kind of intentional onboarding and support. And not every restaurant is able to offer that for a variety of reasons. And so as we've been promoting those kind of characteristics of our employment partners, we had to look ourselves in the mirror and say, are we doing all of those things because we're an employer? We offer transitional employment for our young adults. And the answer was no. And so we had to pause in terms of what we're promoting externally to make sure that we're doing that hard work first. So those are just a little bit about Root's work. Happy to talk later in breakout. And I think Norris will offer this up, but happy to connect with anyone offline after this morning.
Thanks for that, Scott, for that in-depth view of being an ally from the organizational planning and initiatives view. Before we give it to Tracy to wrap it up and give us an eagle eyes, view of the work that's going on. Actually, Nicole actually messaged me and said she wanted to speak a little bit more to how organizations that are actually doing the work with, BIPOC-led or serving organizations can be that ally, given that she works with, so many different ones. So passing it back to Nicole before we give it to Tracy. So all yours, Nicole.
Okay, thank you, Norris, for coming back to me. I'm sorry that I didn't realize we were jumping right into the in-depth conversation. So as far as being an ally for BIPOC organizations, I feel just reaching out and making sure that you're being intentional about reaching out. I've had the organizations such as the Essex County Foundation reach out to us and offer us a spot to speak in front of their network. I've had government officials reach out to us directly and ask us to come out, and that takes work. I know it takes work to find BIPOC organizations, but if that's really something that you're after and you want to make sure you make those connections, you'll make sure you do the research necessary to find these people in your community or outside of your community that are doing work with the BIPOC population in your community or surrounding your community. We also, going back to the Access Community Foundation, they also have resources that they can provide to smaller organizations, and things like trainings on how to better find a board, or how to better create opportunities for fundraising, things like that. Those types of trainings that seem to come easily if you're connected to different organizations. You have those resources readily available to you, but can you make those resources available to organizations such as mine and other organizations in my community that I know about that could really benefit from those types of trainings and resources? You know, if you have someone that you know is out there, you know, doing fundraising, and you know you have another organization that is parallel to yours that is run by a BIPOC, by a person of color, you should, you know, say to that person of color, listen, you know, you're a young organization, we're a young organization, but these are the resources that we have, and this is how we can help, you know, bolster your efforts as well. So, I mean, we're also the same age as Root. North Shore Juneteenth Association started in 2017, and we had our first Juneteenth event in 2017 in Lynn, Massachusetts. And this was, you know, all community members. It wasn't like, you know, lawyers and doctors and all these types of people on our board. It was community members from Lynn came together and said, we want to do a Juneteenth celebration in our city. And we made that happen, you know, and from there, we started having Juneteenth flag raisings and doing all these things that, you know, a young organization with people that have never been in the nonprofit sector, you know what I mean, doing these things, and people assuming that we're able to, that we have like the gumption and we have the know-how and we know all these things, when we really were just trying to start something that would edify our community. We could have used, and we can still use resources from other organizations that are well on their way to, you know, doing much more, you know. So that's just a couple of ways I feel like people could be allies, organizations could be better allies for, you know, community organizations that are led by people of color.
Thanks for that, Cole. Extremely useful information, and we'll be following up with you and others in the questions portion of it. Thanks again. So Tracy, dying to hear from you. Please take us in, or it's all yours.
Thank you so much. Well, my name is Tracy Talbert, and I am just thrilled to have an opportunity to sit in such spaces, to talk authentically about change around racial justice, being a real ally versus performative allyship. And that's something that I want to kind of reference later on at the closing of this conversation. So as he mentioned, I spent 25 years, 22 to 24 years in the banking industry. In the last 10 of those years, I absolutely enjoyed the opportunity of climbing my way up that corporate ladder, so to speak. But each one of those years, I thought it was going to be an opportunity for me to utilize that space or utilize that platform to talk more about building fairness, to talk more about the communities in which businesses are operating. I thought it would be more of an opportunity for me and my leaders to kind of respect and listen to some of the goals and ideas that I had around performance internally, around sustainability, around profitability. And for those 5 years, that did not work as well as I thought it was going to work. So I figured if I went and got my education, that would be another level or another opportunity for me to have my voice heard in those spaces, since I was sitting at the table with 9 or 90% white leaders, and I'm the only Black face in the room, that maybe if I establish some additional credentials, that would allow my voice to be heard, or that I have this opportunity to, again, just be respected. That didn't happen either. So I want to bring it right back until November 9th, 2020 is when I met the Franklin County Community Development Corporation. Well, that's the actual day that I started working there. And I can tell you, for the last 12 months, my voice has been heard. I feel like I am in a space right now where being a Black woman leader exuding and exhibiting authentic voice around racial justice and not holding back any kind of powerful or potent language in order to disrupt and dismantle some of the processes and planning that most businesses are using now, or those type of platforms in order to elevate or advance their DE&I work. So I was hired on November 9th of 2020 as a racial justice community engagement leader. This is a new role for the Franklin County CDC. They've been in existence since 1979. And I don't think my boss would mind me saying I am the first Black person this organization has ever hired. I am the only Black person currently working within the walls of the Franklin County CDC. And we do have people of color that work within those walls. So my program, again, is new. There's a grant from the Massachusetts Community Health and Aging Fund, who is responsible for me being in that position right now. And again, I'm absolutely thrilled to sit into this seat. Part of my job responsibilities is to work primarily with businesses. And what does that look like for businesses within the Franklin County? Right now, Greenfield, but this work is to be more expansive within the Franklin County as a whole. So I sit down and I'm like, okay, what do I do? How am I going to infiltrate the processes and the strategic planning and all of these kind of historically processes that are systemically problematic in one way, but in other ways have gotten businesses the successes that they are in business for, which is profitability, advancement, growth, right? So all of these things that people are looking for when they are in business. So how am I going to do that? One of the first things that I was required to do was to write a theory of change. And I got to tell you, when I was presented with that, I'm like, okay, here we go with some of the same old approaches in order to get change. So how do I deal with that? What am I going to do with how I'm looking at being accountable for process and planning and that busyness around strategies and planning? And I know that there's a place for it, but I also know that embedded within that ask lies systemic issues that would hinder in some way the work getting done. Needless to say, I did create the theory of change, and I also did an evaluation process on how I thought this work was going to roll up within the 5 years. But what I did differently was when I had a chance to meet with the auditors and do an overview of the work that we've done so far, I did not hesitate to explain and to express my concern about the theory of change. And it's not that it was a bad thing, but the fact that I felt comfortable enough and confident enough to talk about within the theory of change, there may be some hindrance to progress and to doing this work as far as dismantling and disrupting. So part of my responsibility, as I said, is to work with business owners. So for probably the first 5 months, 4 or 5 months, I got introduced to many, many businesses within Greenfield. I made that outreach, introduced myself, talking about the work, seeing where businesses are, what are their efforts that they're putting forth with racial justice, what have they done so far, what type of workshops and other exposures have they had with regards to racial justice initiatives. And a lot of things that I've heard is still the same old just voices and focuses around strategically planning for changes that address racial justice and inequities. In the world that I come from, and I can honestly tell you, that what I've learned over the years, that since I have obtained my degrees, is that racial justice work is not intellectual. You cannot intellectualize this work. This is emotional work. So how do you create procedurally an approach to reaching the hearts of people within your staff to get this work done? You can create a strategic plan you want in the world. So all of the other things that I've done within this work, well, I'm going to tell you 3 things that I've done. First of all, I've started to do industry-specific creating presentations, research. So one of the things I was determined not to do was create a blanket or general presentation to bring to these businesses to talk about the racial justice work that is happening in the Franklin County Community Development Corporation. It is not. I have been asked to actually submit something on that level. Show us what you're doing, show us what you got, and then we'll be happy to bring you in and do some training with our staff. And I'm like, this is not how this work is actually going to impact change. What I need you to do for me is to tell me what you think you need. Tell me where you are currently with any of these initiatives, movements, staff, your recruitment initiatives around racial justice, where are you searching? Tell me all of these things that you're doing, and I will go back and I will tailor something to bring back to your organization to create a continuous work program for you. I did one presentation for a financial institution within the Greenfield area, and this is one of the things that I've done differently. Is now I'm going into one of these prestigious financial institutions within the area, and my mind is telling me back to my banking world that, Tracy, if you don't get this right, you're not going to make an impact. You're going to be sitting at that table again, kind of reflecting and remembering what happens when you were at one of these big round tables in the banking conference room and you're trying to speak up and your voice is not being heard. And that's exactly what I walked into to do this presentation with this institution. This big old oval table with all these fancy high back leather chairs, and he's coming in all pressed and looking for some really, really fancy, impressive racial justice strategic plan. Like, okay. So now I get before him and I had an opportunity to say to him, 2 things are going to be different about this presentation. One, I'm not here to impress you. This is not what this is about. And the other piece is that during this presentation, you can't ask me any questions. So the data, all of the research, the background, everything that I'm going to present to you, some of it you may be familiar about, some of it is data that you are kind of familiar with. It was different. It was uncomfortable for him. And when we talk about dismantling and disrupting, and we're saying we want to be comfortable sitting in uncomfortable spaces, do we really mean that? Do we know what it feels like to sit in uncomfortable spaces, listening to things that makes us uncomfortable? It's not easy, but I can honestly say that I have forged a power and a confidence in my voice that when I'm hearing these things, I'm able to push back freely, kindly, professionally, but in a way that says, no, stop and listen to what you're asking. Stop and listen to what you presented. Let's read it together. How does it really sound? Where do you think this is going to make an impact on your team with regards to racial justice? I've learned a lot about language. What are some of the linguistic biases in your language that you continually speak on a day-to-day basis, but are expecting change? You stand on a flawed foundation. It's showing you all of these cracks. It's showing you all of these imperfections, yet we stand there with the mindset of building a hierarchy or this conglomerate of change, and the foundation cannot hold the weight. It can't sustain it. So the fundamentals and the foundations that we are standing and speaking from, we need to look more closely from within. More closely from what we are already doing instead of going outside and bringing in these expertise that we think are going to fix us or fix our problems. So what I learned just briefly about food insecurities and what's happening with people of color in the food world. And I don't know a lot about it, but I know right now that farmers right now just make up 4% of all the farmers of color, just represent 4% in the US right now. At one point, that number was higher, but now it's not. And it has a lot to do with, again, some of the systemic and institutional and barriers that are within the infrastructure. People of color are not easily getting loans, and we know all of this. We absolutely know all of this, so I'm not going to repeat that. So what does it mean to be one more thing before we go. An article was shared with me about some of the characteristics of white dominant culture within the food infrastructure. So there are things that are language such as universalism. What does universalism say? We know what the people want, so we put together this whole kind of maybe food basket, or we're gonna put up a truck and we're gonna give all the people this food. So that's a universalism approach. A neoliberal approach is that if the people would just listen, right? If they just do what they say, if they just show up, they won't be in this situation. And then we have the paternalistic approach and the individual approach. These are some of the flawed characteristics of an attitude or an approach to how the well-intended individual wants to kind of answer or solve the problems of people in these marginalized groups that need help, instead of inviting them to the table and asking them what they really need. I think there are a lot of organizations right now who are doing a good job of ensuring that the voices are at the table. But if they're sitting there, are they there in a tokenism space? Or are we really, really listening to what they have to say? Are we being consistent and intentional about who's at the table? So lastly, I just want to give an example of real allyship versus performative allyship. So this is one of the most dynamic things that has happened to me. And I want to just say emphatically, in my 10+ years of doing this racial justice work, this is one of the most dynamic and the most profound actions that anyone who claimed to be really wanting to do this work, who claimed to be an ally and committed and dedicated to change within the racial justice realm. And this person happens to be my boss, John Waite from the Franklin County Community Development Corporation. In this, about 2 months ago, we were invited to it was this multicultural day from the court system. They do this on the green in Greenfield. They invite various judicial leaders from the Boston area. They come down and they speak to the audience, and there's various cultures of food, and people are doing music and dance. So you had this whole cultural kind of venue and space that you were sitting in. But as I sat there next to my boss, and he doesn't like me to call him his boss, I'm sorry, John. As I sat there next to him, I observed very, very plainly that all of the leaders were sitting up on the platform with their impressive, notebooks and briefcases, and they're looking all busy and letting people know who's in power in this particular space, who the leaders are. So they sit up on the platform, and there is a podium that's in front of them. So each one of them they get up and they go to the podium and they say their words to the community, and they go and sit back down. A couple of people came out from the audience. They walk up to this platform, they go to their podium, but each time our backs are towards these people in power. So I mentioned that to my boss while we were sitting there. So we get up, we go up, it's our turn to present. What do you think my boss did? He disrupted that whole moment. He asked those individuals to please participate and take a seat in the audience. Real allyship. Fearless. This was not performative. He heard what I said. He observed what that really looked like for them sitting in their places of power, and he disrupted that moment. Did they like it? Oh no. A couple of them were very, very, they didn't blatantly say that they were upset, but you can tell by body languages, there was a couple of twisted lips, like, and they're clenching their books and their briefcases as they step down off of that podium into the audience, feeling like, what just happened? Am I actually being dismissed from my place of power? Real allyship. And that is something that I will never forget as long as I continue to do this work, and not as long as I am continuing to do this work. We say we want change, but when we are put in the center of an opportunity, we get afraid. And if you are afraid, that's natural. So who is standing next to you as that supportive system and saying, go ahead, I got you. Now, performative allyship happened with my board on the African American Female Professors Award Association. We celebrated 5 years in 2017. This is my nonprofit in which we honor and recognize African American female professors who teach in higher education, who only make up 1% in that world of higher education. So for the 5 years, my idea was to reach out to all the college presidents, 13 of them within Western Mass, and invite them to have a dialogue and a conversation with me about leading for an inclusive culture on their college campuses. So when I present this to my board, and all along, they're okay with, preparing for this work. And yes, that's a good idea. And yes, we need to draft the letter and get the letter. And what I did, I took the letter and I knocked on every college campus door. I went to each one of them. I didn't email them. I did some cold calling, if you will, and I showed up on the campus and I asked for the president's office and I introduced myself and I gave them the letter inviting them. I went to 13 campuses. 7 of them agreed to speak with me, to share in our 5-year celebration. But when I brought this back to my board, now here we go with performative allyship. They started backpedaling. Well, Tracy, now that you got them, you're going to need to behave in a certain way. You need to prepare them for the conversation. Did you send them questions ahead of time? You don't want to embarrass them or make them feel uncomfortable, and you don't want to build bridges. I'm like, what is happening right now? Performative allyship. And if something did go wrong, they would have left me standing there all by myself. So what I encourage in this work is to accept that it's uncomfortable and you're going to be afraid sometimes. Face your fears. Come and find me if you're afraid, because I will stand there with you. People give themselves permission to stay stuck by constantly talking about how challenging this work is. That could be a negative space within your conversations of expansion and growth. Stop talking about how challenging this work is. We know that. Stop stating the obvious. We cannot move forward if we keep saying the same thing. What is the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting something different to happen. I love the work that I do at Franklin County CDC. There are moments when I know it's been uncomfortable for the staff and myself being the only Black person, but they're in it to win it, and I know they are. The questions that they're asking, the vulnerability that is exposed in moments during our staff meetings sometimes, those are real. Process, planning, intellectualizing this work, in my opinion, is not working. I don't use the word trainings. You train a dog, you don't train DE&I. That's my perspective, and I don't expect everybody to embrace that right now. There's certain other expressions and terms in this work, DE&I. We're talking disruption and dismantling. The diversity, equity, inclusion is a nice way to stay in line, to keep people in line, doing this hard work. So I just, again, want to thank you for this opportunity. There's so much more that I think I would like to say, but I know that I'll have other opportunities as I continue to work within Franklin County and the Greenfield area to maybe meet all of you and continue to do this work. So thank you, Norris, and thank you all for listening.
No, thank you, Tracy, and thank you, John. Yeah, to your bot, like that was powerful. Thank you to all of the panelists. I feel that really tied in the different viewpoints of this work. So again, like, thank you. And not trying to jump quickly, but because our panelists are so powerful and bring such viewpoints to this area, we are running, we're running behind schedule. So there was a portion of this session that was meant for breakout rooms where we would divvy up the room with the different panelists toward the end, but we're actually going to save that part and we will stay together and we'll take the questions together pretty much, but that's the last part. For the next 10 minutes though, it is 11:40 now. We have some thought teasers here. Some questions to the panelists posed by myself that's really meant to dig out the themes of what being an ally is, weeding out, performative allyship versus genuine allyship. And so we're going to jump right in. So the first question, and keeping in to the panelists, keeping in mind we've got about 10, maybe 12 minutes for this section. So the first question goes to Tracy and Nicole, actually. And so can you speak to the sorts of strategies and programming that needs to be considered in order to imbue equity, in order to have equity happening at your organizations, or actually, let's not say your organization, at organizations in general? What sorts of strategies and programming should organizations consider if they're out to really imbue that at their organizations? And Nicole, we'll start off with you.
There's a couple of groups that embody different organizations, such as the Newland Coalition. It's an organization where many community organizations come together and make up that organization. So is the Creative Collective out of Salem. They are also an organization that, sort of like a chamber of commerce, but it's community organizations. And, with Creative Collective, it's also businesses and community organizations. So when you have something like that, that type of vehicle where you have a whole bunch of different organizations working together as just like a chamber of commerce as well, they should be having, opportunities for these organizations to come together and actually lean on each other and say to one another, what are you doing that's working? What am I doing that's working? To me, that's allyship, to really be wanting to give of your resources and to see both organizations or both groups, together to move forward. I also feel when I reach out to organizations to do different activities, such as the Diversity Matters Festival that we had in Lynn, over the summer. I reached out to a lot of different organizations to make that happen. But I noticed once we were all together that even if someone had an idea that would probably, make the activity or the community event work better, they didn't, they withheld some of the information that they could have gave us to make that, or to make that that community event the best that it could be. I could tell that people were not giving their all and making sure that that event happened to the best of its ability. You know what I mean? So I feel like when you're collaborating with different organizations and different groups, that if you have resources, if you know of ideas, or if you have a formula that you've done this before, that if you're going to say yes to that that collaboration, that you should be bringing your best self to that collaboration and making sure that all organizations benefit from your intelligence or your intellectual property. Because why would you say yes to combining and to collaborating if you weren't going to bring that best self with you? So I feel like true allyship is really that, like, not saying, oh, yeah, I'll come to the meeting and I'll be a part of the meeting or whatever, and then sit in the meeting and not say anything, or be, you know what I mean? Or say, yes, I'll be a part of this collaborative group, but I'm not going to give of myself in there. And, that collaborative group is not really giving of itself, lending itself to that type of allyship and collaboration. So I feel like that, really just keeping a lens on being what you say you're going to be, not just saying you're going to be it and this is what you stand for, but actually putting that into action is real important.
Thanks, Nicole. Very thorough answer there. Thanks, Tracy.
Well, I just wanted to kind of say internally, leadership, to understand what is happening in your organization. So before, and I know that outside consultants and outside professionals, they have something, a certain skill that you think you probably need, but I think leaders should do some internal soul searching with their staff first. Understand what your staff needs before you bring in outside sources.
Thanks,
and be specific and be intentional. That's my response. Perfect.
Thank you, Tracy. All right. And the next question goes to you, and it's can you speak to some of the food projects some of the food projects diversity initiatives? Wow.
Totally fine. I think I'll try and focus on one or two things here. One of the things that just in following up with what Tracy just said about doing some internal soul searching and understanding of what the staff needs before you go externally, I think is really important. And that's one of the things that we have started doing, was both mostly in the form of what we're calling a Jedi Audit, which is an all staff survey, and now is an all staff plus youth survey that gets at, are we living out our commitment to this as an organization? And why do you feel that way? Kind of, so why or why not? Are we proactively addressing issues of race, identity, power, and privilege? Yes or no? Are we recruiting well? And, are you feeling like you can come to work with your whole self? There's a lot of different ones, and I'm happy to share the questions, but, we did one in March. We analyzed it. We shared back with all staff, with the full staff in a meeting with lots of room for conversation around, this is what we think we heard that you need, or that you see that we're not living up to. And these are some of the things we're going to try and address in the coming months. And then we did it again in October. And we plan to continue to do it at least annually, maybe continue to do it every 6 months. But the idea being that let's find out from staff, and there's a lot of great information in the more narrative answers that they give, but there's some key takeaways and some of the just quantitative Likert scale, how do you feel about this, that make it really clear where we're missing the mark and where we need to address it. But not just surveying, but identifying what rises to the top as the most concerning for people and how can we address that. The other thing that I think is really interesting that we've done is we've started using these things we're calling project briefs for some significant initiatives. And in that, it sort of lays out what is the work that we're trying to do. And it's not necessarily Jedi work, but it's what is the work we're trying to do against this project. And the thing that we've done more recently is drop in our values into this project brief, very, very close to the top, with a thing like a kind of a checklist. Are you thinking about these values as you're approaching this project? And a couple of them are youth adult partnership. Are we hearing our youth voice? Is there a place to hear our youth voice in this project? Another value is around resident leadership and allyship. Are we thinking about what the community needs are as we design the project? Not after, but before we even get to the next step. So those kinds of things that force us to think about stuff before we move forward, I think are really important for us. And we are thinking about trainings, and I'm going to rethink what I call them, Tracy, but we are thinking about getting some external support in that. And one of the things we want to get external support in is kind of a training about trainings, which is how do we facilitate in a trauma-informed way when we're doing this kind of work? How do we think about setting up these opportunities in a way that make them approachable for everyone and accessible for everyone? So that's another aspect of it that I think will be important. So we are getting a little outside support, and we are putting some funding against it. We've got some funding against our Jedi work, for a budget for it for the first time in as long as I know. But, you know, so we're thinking about where can we access more information? We have a lot internally, and there may be some external stuff that would be really helpful for us to think about. But I think those are some of the key things.
Great, thanks for that, Anne. And moving on to Scott, can you speak to seeding the spotlight and highlighting other voices in the conversation?
Sure, happy to, Norris. And I'll be brief here. I just want to touch on two things. You know, I think is in our work here at Root, and my work as an executive director, I think, you know, there's two approaches that we try to do. One is, you know, when we're setting out to, if someone has an idea at the staff level, board level, or, you know, the community approaches us with a suggestion or idea that might highlight or overlap with Root's mission, I think what we try to do is to look out, like, who else out in the community is doing this work. And I think that was especially true for us in the community catering, our food insecurity initiative. Like, there are dozens and dozens of frontline agencies and actors who've been doing this work. And, you know, we really wanted to, before we proposed something that was like a new solution, a new idea, a Root branded, you know, fill in the blank, you know, we had to find out who's doing this work and what do they need? How can we support their work? And I think there's one of my favorite community leaders was Sergeant Shriver, who's the director of the War on Poverty. And he said, we could solve every social problem if people just didn't have to get credit for it. And I think that is so true in the nonprofit sector. And, you know, and obviously the philanthropic system kind of makes our competition for resources attention point, or it can. So I think we've tried to lean into who else is doing the work, how can we support what they're doing, and what's our superpower or what's our resource that we can lend to the work that's being done. So that's number one. And then the second sounds a little cliche, but for me as a white cisgendered nonprofit executive director, is just practicing the art of silence. And, you know, to Tracy's point, like, people who look like me have been up on the stage with the briefcases and the, you know, the tailored pants. And I need to listen. And so I think sometimes I'll get feedback from my board to be more assertive, or to be, you know, more present my voice forward more, when really I think the power is actually stepping back, to use some of Anne's words earlier, and listening and not having to take up space, but then, you know, asking questions where I need to learn to clarify, and offering after that act of silence.
Scott, thanks for that. So yeah, you panelists are rock stars. Before we close off this session and we move on to the Q&A portion, in one sentence, what advice, you all have demonstrated some history or intentionality when, approaching equity and, having that at your organizations. In a quick sentence, what advice would you give to other well-meaning allies? And Tracy, we'll start off with you.
One sentence, that would be to reevaluate what leadership means in your organization.
Thanks, Tracy. Scott.
Norris, this is so tough. All right, so one sentence. I'm going to pick up on one of the last things I said. Practice the art of silence.
About you, Nicole.
Be sure you are taking action and not just speaking words.
All right, Nicole. And Anne?
I'll take some of Tracy's words too and say, because I think it rang really true to me, step into the discomfort and sit in the discomfort, because when you find out you're doing things wrong, it's very uncomfortable, but that's where the learning happens.
All right, thank you all. And so with that, we are moving into the Q&A session. If anyone has any questions, you can post them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or just or you can just call it out. We've got about 10 minutes, but yeah, if anyone has any questions for our panelists or myself, now the floor is open. Alrighty. Let's see. Nothing in the chat. And no hands raised. Oops, sorry.
I have a question, actually. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I am hesitating to be technical here because I really want to honor the emotional space. And I'm also interested in any sort of organizational tools like decision-making, meeting styles, and yeah, just if there's been any, what has worked in your organization for dismantling hierarchy and redistributing power, if any. Thank you.
Does any of our panelists want to speak to that? Anne, Tracy, Cole?
Well, I think I will take a stab at that. And again, the Franklin County Community Development Corporation is definitely in a powerful dynamic learning stage. And what we have done is actually mapped out or charted out right now what the hierarchy chart looks like. And when you look at it, oh my God, it's linear, it's rigid, the lines are just hard, and it kind of speaks silently to some of the just the rigidness of what hierarchy, who points to who. So I actually took a stab at creating a more flexible flow type of growing leafy type of chart. And that's something we will continue to look at and to take a evaluation. I think I did a good job with presenting a couple of them that are more soft lines, and it doesn't directly point to the rigidness of hierarchy within the institution. So that will actually help to dismantle again and disrupt some of that structural busyness and bureaucracy that prevent institutions and organizations from moving forward. So that is one thing. Take a look at your existing hierarchy chart and try to redo it. That's what I would recommend.
Thanks for that, Tracy. Any other questions? Oh, sorry, Anne.
No, I was just going to add that just as a tool, that project brief that I mentioned, because it also is very explicit and transparent about who's responsible for decision-making, who's responsible for our project. And this applies to all of our goals and stuff, and who has to approve it, but who also needs to have input into it. So we make sure that people who are going to be affected by a decision have input into the decision, but it's really transparent how that works, and also makes us think about how high up does that approver need to be, and maybe it doesn't need to happen at that high a level, and maybe we can start to push down some of that decision making. So it's just a thought, and I'm happy to share that once we finalize it. But yeah, happy to share it if people want it.
Thank you. Actually, can the panelists put their email addresses in the chat, please, just so everyone has that and can get in touch with you? And also, I think Shannon has a question. Shannon, do you want me to read it? Actually, yep, there you are, Shannon. You can.
Hello. So in trying to build like a non-hierarchical leadership cohort that is being built by white women and with a very strong commitment to social justice, racial equity, and all the things, the risk of like tokenizing, like we're having this internal conversation about how when we're reaching out and inviting individuals to be part of this, and this happens in other places, like, you know, the white folks in the room is like, well, we have to have folks of color participating in this, that it feels like we're tokenized, like we're reaching out, having inauthentic relationships because the drive is like, we need to, you know, we want to have more broadly diverse, inclusive, representative folks in the room and participating and contributing. So I don't know if you could say something on like the error of tokenism. Like, I struggle with that. Like, well, I'm not reaching out to you just because you're a person of color, but because you really have something to offer and we really value and we want your skills and ideas and everything. But at the face of it, it's like a bunch of white ladies inviting folks of color in versus like trying to just like clear the table for everyone to come in as equals. And it just feels very, I wonder if you could offer thoughts, criticism, hardware, like, just in a new way to think about the intention is there, but we understand the impact often looks like tokenism. It can come out like that. So at the risk of trying to describe that more, I think I'm curious for your advice.
I feel like I feel like the invitation is needed, and most of the time the invitation is welcomed as long as the invitation is being, you know, given in the way that you just spoke it. Like, you know, yes, you are a person of color, but we value you and we see that you're competent and capable, and that's why we're asking. And we're not just asking you, we're also, you know, doing more research and more outreach. And if there's anyone that you might know of that you can bring to the table, also we invite those people as well. Like, it needs to, the ask needs to be really, you know, friendly, and it needs to be inviting, and it needs to acknowledge the person's background and skill set and what they can bring to the table. It can't just be, you know, we're doing this and you're the, you know, the person of color and we thought that we'd reach out to you. It needs to be all encompassing, basically. It can't just be, you know, that one ask as a person of color, and that's what we're looking for, you know?
And the other thing, if I could just very quickly, is to be sure that I really think people's internal motives, they really show up when you least expect it. So if you are authentically inviting them to the table because of what they bring, that will be apparent. Just don't have them sit at the table. Make sure that you're listening. Make sure that they're contributing. Make sure that they are a full part of that conversation. And don't just, every time something happens, I would not say, well, what do you think about that, Nicole? Well, Nicole, let's ask Nicole, what does she think about that? Because she's the only person of color sitting at that table. don't isolate them in moments where if she's not saying anything, then she's not saying anything and she doesn't feel like there's something to be contributed at this time. So don't kind of highlight them because they're at the table. They're at the table, they're part of the team.
Thanks for that. And we are 1 minute over. If you have any further questions, please reach out to our panelists, myself. They've left their email information in the chat. I just want to thank you all for coming today and our amazing panelists for sharing their amazing viewpoints and technical know-how at this intersection of equity, food, and collaboration. Again, thank you all for coming. It was my pleasure speaking with you all and hosting this session today. On behalf of the collaborative and our sponsors, you have a great rest of your day. Thank you all.
Thank you, Norris.